So when you think about it, what is surrounding you? Trees, water, rocks, plants, animals? All these things are essential to life and how you obtain energy. This is ecosystem ecology in plain English.
So, we all know that energy is essential to life so our enzymes and organs can function properly. But how is energy obtained? First of all, it's important to know where energy comes from. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy can change form but cannot be created or destroyed. And so that means that there will always be a consistent amount of energy in the world, and that is the second law of thermodynamics.
There are also many different kinds of energy, such as mechanical, chemical, radioactive, solar, and wind energy. You may be wondering how we get this energy. Well, if you are an autotroph, then you can produce your own energy. Plants are autotrophs. And if you are a heterotroph, then you must eat other foods in order to obtain the necessary amount of energy.
Things like rocks, sunlight, and water are called abiotic factors and can affect biotic factors, which are things like animals and plants. These abiotic factors can affect biotic factors because they cause certain organisms to live in certain places. For example, if a plant needs a lot of water, then it can't live in the desert. Now that we know the basics, let's move on to the properties and relationships found in ecosystems. Abiotic factors can also affect dispersion patterns. There are some where each organism is evenly spaced apart, some where they are clustered, usually because there are more resources there, and finally random, which is usually caused by the wind, most commonly with plants.
The levels of organization on Earth go from biome to ecosystem to community to population to species. And in this video, we are focusing on ecosystems.
So what makes up an ecosystem? Well, as we said before, abiotic and biotic factors. There are different sizes and densities of ecosystems. The number of different species that we find in an ecosystem is known as its richness. So if you see 6 different types of things in our ecosystem, then we know that the richness is 6. The amount of individual species is known as the abundance. So if we see 5 squirrels and 2 birds, then the abundance of squirrels is 5 and the abundance of birds is 2.
So with plants and animals, there has to be food chains. The transfer of energy goes from the sun to the producers to the consumers to the decomposers. Each time, only 10% of the energy is transferred from one to the other. So, if the sun gave 100 energy molecules to the plants, then the plants would only give 10 to the consumers, and the consumers would only give the decomposers 1. This type of energy transfer takes place in many different niches. A fundamental niche is where an organism could live, and a realized niche is where it does live.
In different niches, there are different types of relationships between animals. One type of relationship is mutualism, which is where both organisms benefit from the relationship. This is shown through clownfish and anemones. The anemones protect the clownfish and give them a home, while the clownfish protect the anemones from being eaten. Another relationship is parasitism, and that is when one organism benefits while the other is harmed. An example of this is between humans and ticks. Ticks suck the blood out of humans, which harms them, but the tick gets food, which is good for them. Next, there is commensalism, which is when one organism is benefited while the other remains unaffected. An example of this is between barnacles and whales, because barnacles get protection from the whale, but the barnacles have no effect on the whale. These 3 relationships are known as symbiotic relationships.
The fourth relationship between organisms is competition. This is when 2 animals are competing for the same source. An example of this is when squirrels are competing for dominance in an area. There are 2 solutions to competition. One is called competitive exclusion, which is when one of the 2 organisms gets kicked out, and the other solution is called resource partitioning. That is when 2 animals learn to share an area and food source.
Finally, the last relationship between animals is called predator and prey. That is when one animal eats the other animal as food. An example of this is between wolves and squirrels. Predator and prey relationships lead to an interesting cycle called the boom and bust cycle. It starts off as having more prey than predators, but eventually there are an equal amount of the 2, and then ultimately more predators than prey. That part is called the bust of the cycle, and the boom occurs when there are more prey than predators.
Other growth cycles include exponential growth, which is when the amount will continue to grow over the carrying capacity. There is logistic growth, which is when the graph grows in an S-like shape and eventually flattens out at the carrying capacity. The human population seems to be doing that. There are also different survivorship curves. Type 1 is the human population graphs, which shows that when humans are younger, they are less likely to die. Type 2 is when there are a lot of predators, and it shows that when there are fewer predators, the more likely the animals will survive. Finally, there is type 3, which is when an organism has a lot of babies. That shows that it is unlikely for a lot of them to survive, but if they do, it is typical of them to live a longer life.
This has been Ecosystem Ecology in plain English.